All right, so I'm always excited to talk about Trump's rhetoric, but I want to give a quick disclaimer. First, I'm not a Trump supporter, but I'm also not here to show that his supporters are stupid or hateful or idiotic or inferior. Rather, I'm just interested in why people find him so compelling. So I want to start with a sort of quick primer. Is it moving?
It should be there.
There it is. Start with a quick primer on rhetoric. Usually when people use the word, it refers to deceptive or insincere or obfuscating language. So like politicians get accused of using rhetoric. It's the proverbial lipstick on a pig. Rhetoric scholars take a broader view. I can't tell if it's moving or not. It's not moving on my screen. So
Well, let me make sure it's working here. One moment. I've got multiple things going on my screen. I'm going to stop sharing just a second.
Not that I mind talking.
I know you can go on longer. It should be going. I'm going to start now at slide 2. It should be going every 15 seconds.
It's not shared.
It will. It will.
All right, so rhetoric scholars take a broader view of what rhetoric is, and we essentially are interested in how persuasion works. So we study how people use symbols, which include deceptive language, to persuade themselves and others to believe and act in certain ways. Now, obviously, we're interested in Trump because he is very persuasive, and the obvious question is why. So what I want to do today is sort of identify 3 of the ways in which he is most persuasive and identify some of the tactics associated. So for rhetoricians, sincerity is a performance of virtue. It demonstrates that you're really deeply committed to an issue and lends credibility. And unexpectedly, it's one of Trump's major appeals. Pathos is sort of one of his things that he's most known for. But an example is that he calls opponents demeaning nicknames, which feeds his supporters contempt for his opponents. Spontaneity is a great way that you can show sincerity, and Trump does this very well. He seems to be convinced of what he is saying, and in seeming to be convinced, he is authoritative. Paradoxically, lying and misinformation can actually make you seem more sincere because of the depth of commitment. So if you're willing to lie for something, then it shows how sincere and committed you are. And then paratextics is an associational logic. So you think about A and it makes you think about B. How most people talk on a day-to-day basis, but it's not how most political speeches go. But he does it in speeches and it makes him look sincere. Agency by proxy is another area where Trump excels. He's a master at convincing his audience that they can share his power and they revel in demonstrations of his power. One way he does this is identification. So identification is the idea that an audience needs to feel like they are like a speaker. And so for example, when Trump says things like, the elites don't want us to succeed, he's identifying himself with real Americans. Commonplaces are the building blocks of identification. They're beliefs that most people in a culture or community share. And Trump is exceedingly good at identifying himself with traditional conservative commonplaces. Ad populum is Latin for appeal to the people. Trump does this constantly by saying things like, a lot of people are saying, but his claims about ratings and crowd sizes and Twitter are also part of this game. He adopts agency of the bandwagon. Ad baculum is an appeal to the stick. So it could be in threats of physical violence, but also it's overwhelming people with information. And for Trump, it also includes withholding support. The last category is plausible deniability, which is Trump's ability to deny knowledge or responsibility for things that he says. Often he does this through implication, and he says, oh, I didn't mean that, you misunderstood me. So in 2015 and 2016, a number of Trump's supporters encouraged voters to take him seriously and not literally. In other words, you could trust his intentions as long as you don't focus too carefully on what he says, because he'll actually deny that he meant that. Hyperbole is probably Trump's most quintessential appeal. He grossly over-exaggerates because he thinks people like grandiosity. The greatest, the largest, the most beautiful COVID-19 tests. To quote means you too is an attempt to deflect criticism by showing that his critics also do bad things. So during the impeachment, for example, he routinely deflected to Joe Biden's supposed connections to Burisma. Finally, paralipsis, which is, I'm not saying, I'm just saying. So like at rallies, for example, it's say, I would never say Jeb Bush is low energy. I'm just saying, how would he deal with Iran? So all of these are ways that Trump has done a really good job of appealing to groups of people who identify closely with him. And even though it's easy to look at those people and think they're not smart or they're not intelligent or they're easily led, in fact, everybody is, under the right circumstances, everybody is persuaded by these sorts of things. And it's why rhetoricians have been studying them for 2,000 years. Thank you.
Thank you.
15 seconds is really fast.
It really is, isn't it? Someone, I was getting comments, there was some sort of something on the screen or something in the way. So I'm sorry if anybody didn't see it, but you will be able to see it. We'll make sure you get a copy of the recording. Jamie, you had a question.
So, I mean, I have 1,000 questions, but let's see, I'll try to pick one that I think is a good one to start with. So all of that is incredibly interesting analysis of what he's doing. So I guess my question is, oh God, so many. I want to know, why don't people see through it is probably my main question, which I don't know. That's so that's one thing. And it's also, have people studied whether this is a thing that he's just always done, or has this developed over time? Like, why does he seem to be immune to people seeing through his techniques? And is he even aware that he's using techniques? And help me, please help.
So those are both questions that I have spent literally the last 5 years trying to understand. And a lot of it is the sincerity thing. So I started studying Trump's rhetoric during 2015 when it was running up to it. And in doing that, I was also studying what people are saying about Hillary Clinton. And over and over and over again, critics of Hillary Clinton are saying she looks test marketed, right? So they went out and they used slogans that they thought would work well in a test market, and they picked the one that they thought would be the most appealing. And what Trump did is very much not that, right? He comes out on stage and he says a ridiculous thing, and everybody gets really excited and all worked up, and he's like, you guys are whatever. He never apologizes. He never takes responsibility for it. And ironically or paradoxically, or however you want to think about it, it feels really sincere. It feels like he is a man of the people, and Hillary Clinton is test marketed and not, and therefore, by contrast, he is very sincere. Sincerity is a thing that is really important for his supporters. And in fact, a big part of why, like, when he says a thing and then changes his mind, everybody goes, well, this is it. This is going to sink him. And in fact, it's not. What it does is it reinforces the sense that he's just sort of off the cuff. And, of course, he can't always have all the numbers in front of him, but he feels the truth, right? He feels the truth with you. And if he feels angry, it doesn't actually matter what the facts are, because he's feeling the same things that you're feeling. And I'm sure he doesn't know that he's doing this, but it's a thing that people have been studying for thousands of years. And in fact, one of the people that I was referring to in the talk is Hermogenes, and he was writing in like the 2nd century AD. And he was writing about how one of the ways that you appear sincere is to be wrong. Like, just be really angry and be wrong, because if you sound like you know what you're supposed to be saying, then it actually sounds like you're not actually committed to it. You're too tested. So that's, 1900 years ago he's writing that. So that's to me, that is one of the major parts of it, is that it doesn't actually matter what he says a lot of times, because his supporters feel like they're sharing with him the sense of outrage, or the sense of anger, the sense of victimization, or all of those other sorts of things.
Hey, I have a question. So, I mean, the large majority of politicians besides him are not like this, right? Just speaking purely of the rhetorical techniques, like there are a lot of politicians out there who are, very, very, tested, or not tested, like sort of sound canned, right? But why have these politicians been successful for decades, centuries? How did that happen?
Well, they haven't been. Donald Trump is actually, stylistically, Donald Trump is a lot like what politicians would have been like in most places, even in the 19th century. And in fact, there is a very strong tradition of the kind of political speech that Donald Trump engages in throughout American history. There are schools that will teach it to you. The thing is that we have traditionally thought of our president as being an expert of sorts, right? Like a steady person manning the country. And so oftentimes people who are like that have not risen to the level of presidential politics, because it's unnerving to people. But one of the things about Donald Trump is that in the 2015 run-up to the election, there were, 17, 18 candidates, and 16 of them sounded basically interchangeable. And Donald Trump didn't. And so part of what he did well was to sort of say all the things that they were saying. I mean, Donald Trump's politics and his policies are very much in keeping with 60 years of Republican politics. They're extreme versions of it, but they're in keeping largely with lower taxes, smaller government, those sorts of things. But he managed to do it in a way that was entertaining to people who do not ordinarily participate in politics. And so he was a really appealing figure to people, the primaries, such that when it all shook out, he was the guy. And so he continued to do it, and he continued to sort of stand out against the very traditional, tried version of American presidential politicians. And it worked.
Thank you.
Chris?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Sure.
Yes.
Cool. So a couple observations. I'd be interested in your comparing and contrasting to either of these two examples. One, I have a friend from Cameroon who, when Trump was elected, she told me, "You've elected an African strongman." Mm-hmm. And that probably goes to what you were saying about this is very standard for politicians at lower levels of our government. Two, at least some televangelists also seem to have this shoot from the hip, spontaneous, let it all out, don't care what you do as long as you do something big. I'm wondering if you see a similarity there.
So yes, he's been compared, I think, reasonably compared as a speaker to Idi Amin. Idi Amin, now I can't remember what country he was from, but Idi Amin was well known in the 1980s as sort of being bombastic, and everything about Idi Amin was the biggest and the most exciting, and he was the richest and the smartest and everything. And there are videos of Idi Amin next to Donald Trump, and they're in some cases like verbatim. So there is very much this tradition of, I was actually expecting you to ask about Hitler. There's also like, there are useful and reasonable comparisons to Hitler in his speaking. They get really easily and really quickly into really bad comparisons, which is another easy way to like for it to fall apart. But I think actually the African strongmen are an easier comparison to make because stylistically it is very similar, but we tend not to fall into the same levels of, and therefore Donald Trump is Hitler. Televangelists, I mean, it's not an accident that evangelicals have gone in so far with Donald Trump. He is more than happy to align himself with preachers like Kenneth Copeland and other megachurch preachers. And often, so their organizing style and their speaking style and their leadership style, all of them are authoritarian in various ways, but it's like there's one guy in charge and that guy makes the decisions. And that is not true of all evangelical churches, but it is true of a very particular strand of evangelical churches that largely goes for Donald Trump, like in huge numbers. So yes, and again, I'm not sure that he knows, I'm not sure that it's an intentional thing, but it's certainly a rhetorical affect that he brings to it.
Batman.
Hi. I always put a weird name. My name's Brandon. I work with Jamie.
I like Batman.
Ryan, great presentation. And this may be more of a theoretical thing than an exact answer, but I guess it's kind of a two-part question. The first part being, do you think as certain groups, evangelicals who seem to be very devout and like all this other stuff, there seem to be blinders that get put on when certain things happen, and then other times they stick to a strict schedule, but then other times they'll ignore things.
So
yeah. So what can we do to overcome the blinders? And I try to stay kind of purple in the middle, and I just try to pick the smartest person, just like you would if you go to surgery. You want the best surgeon. But how do you get over the tribalism of some people, like ignoring certain things and not others? And how do you get them to pay attention to the rhetoric itself?
That is the $1 million question. So the answer is yes to your first question. There are certainly blinders to things that then fall away in other cases. The qualification to that is that we all do this all the time. It's really easy, for example, to see somebody else acting badly and think that we would turn that person in, and then when our friend acts badly, we're more than willing to sort of turn the other direction. Or even the notion that we're purple and that we pick the best person is itself an ideological commitment, right? And it's really easy to look at other people's sort of ways of behaving and sort of miss how we also participate in those. And I think it's important to say that because, I mean, mostly who I hang out with is California liberals. And I constantly am sort of in conversations with her, like, how can this happen? How is this even, what is going on? And then, you know, like, I'll have the kombucha and like in those same sorts of communities, we still do the same thing. Like, that's how we organize ourselves, basically. That's how people since time immemorial have organized themselves. How persuasion works, like the most reliable forms of persuasion are individual, person to person. And you build communities and you build relationships over time, and people slowly change their minds. but that means that you also change your mind slowly over time in relation to people. So there is no easy answer. Unfortunately, there's not a pill that we can drop in. Where we have found the most success as a country over the last 150 years, give or take, is when there have been major institutional changes during the progressive era, for example, when there's implemented all sorts of school requirements and changes to social programs. Pretty quickly, people sort of turned towards the institutional values and benefits. But the people who are in charge of the institutions right now are not inclined to want to change how people support Donald Trump. So it's a tough haul, I suppose is what I'm saying.
Carrie Lynn, unmute yourself. I'll unmute you. Oh, there you go.
Brian, can you talk, and this may take you a little further than you want to go, but can you talk about how the doubt of media plays into the whole rhetoric patching? I find that one of the most fascinating, that, you know, Republicans don't believe the New York Times, right? I mean, so you're reading, quote, facts, and facts aren't facts. You know, the manipulation, I don't know, run with that.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, how much time you got? We'll be here for days.
I'm here. We're all here.
I will say that sort of, I'll try and give you a thumbnail of this. The assumption that media was reliable and based on facts is a new concept. I mean, it really didn't take off anywhere in the world till about the 1880s, give or take. So the notion that we could rely on media to give us good factual information is relatively new concept. Prior to that, all media was more or less what our media is now. It was partisan, it was counterfactual, it was deeply invested. That said, we did have, a good, a few decades where we could rely on the New York Times more or less. But the current sort of turn against the media is 50 years in the making, right? It really sincerely started in about the 1970s, beginning of the 1970s, with Nixon. Nixon aligns himself with the Southern Strategy and the evangelical churches, moral minority. And there's a tremendous investment in conservative think tanks. And so this sort of, the moment that we're at now has been a deep investment of time and money and energy in conservative and really, far right conservative, even to the point of fascist circles for 50 years. And it hit its stride with Fox News. And there are lots of people who get their news only from Fox News. And in fact, now there are lots of places that people are getting their news where Fox News is the liberal end of the news that they get. And so the sort of drumbeat of you can't trust the New York Times, it's liberal, it's whatever, goes back to the point that I was making in response to Batman's question, Brandon's question, which is that persuasion didn't happen quickly. It happened very slowly over time in churches, on Fox News, people that they thought they could trust. If you go back and you watch like 2020 in the 1980s, 1990s, John Stossel is warming people up, not intentionally, but he's warming people up for Fox News, and then he moves on to Fox News, right? So there's all sorts of ways where people have started in liberal media and then had conversions where they move into Fox News. And the media the media sphere is fascinating and huge and terrifying. It is, I have read compelling arguments that we are in a very similar media atmosphere as we were in 1880, right? Just prior to the Civil War. I'm sorry, 1860, just prior to the Civil War.
Bruce?
I'm sure you've read Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine. How do you reconcile that with the 60-year slow change that you've just been talking about, which I'm not arguing with, I just find a dichotomy there.
Well, the shock doctrine works equally as well across the political spectrum. So liberals, neoliberals have made really good use of it. Businesses have made really good use of it. So it's not specific at all to the conservatives or to Republicans. And I think that's what I would say is a major distinction, is that it's easy to point. I mean, you could find examples of people all over the political spectrum who are willing to employ the shock doctrine to their benefit. What conservatives have done is they have consistently and slowly invested in the notion that you cannot trust major institutions. You can't trust the government. You can't trust the media. You can't trust anything that is a major institution like that. And specifically liberal institutions like classical liberalism, you just can't trust those things. And that has not been the drumbeat of liberals, for example. It's not been the drumbeat of centrists. It's not been the drumbeat even of center-right Republicans until really in the last 25 years. So conservatism has invested in undermining institutions in ways that other people across the political spectrum have not, even when they've been more than happy to invest in the shock doctrine, sort of the way of behaving the shock doctrine.
Thank you. Chris, and then one more question.
Yeah, you talk about undermining institutions. When I look at some of the things that have been going on recently, where states are using National Guard to protect their COVID tests from the federal government, it seems almost as though the people in power in the federal government want the US to dissolve. Is that just divisive rhetoric for the point of divisiveness, or do you think that, can you tell whether there are people who actually want that to happen, or do they just want us all to think it'll happen?
Yes, they want it to happen. And they have been, in fact, in lots of cases, quite open about it. So in 2006, 2007, something like that, there was a bombshell published in which there was a meeting with, I think it was the Koch brothers and some other multinational billionaires, talking about how awful democracy is, and boy, they can't wait to get rid of democracy. And they didn't think Bush was going to do it, but they felt like it was on its last legs. Fascism in the turn of the 20th century was built explicitly and specifically on destroying liberal institutions, courts, democratic governments, parliaments, all that sort of stuff, on the notion that sort of social Darwinism, right? The strong will rise to the top, and that's the way it should be. And in fact, democratic governments are built on inverting nature's true course. They're supporting the poor, the weak, the sick, at the expense of the young, the healthy, the virile, all that stuff. Now, I don't think that most people in 21st century America are committed fascists. But what I do think is that a lot of people who are interested in seeing the institutions of America sort of fall apart, nevertheless have a real sincere interest in the notion that the strong should be allowed to rise to the top and the weak should be allowed to, well, you know, die if they have to. And it's really interesting to watch like the pro-COVID rallies right now going on, and people holding up signs that say, well, you know, you got to let the old people die and we'll open up the government again, or the, you know, politicians all over the country saying, no, you know, you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. And so it's this investment in the rhetoric of some people are worth saving, some people are not worth saving, and all of the institutions that we have that are designed to invert that natural curve need to go away, need to be destroyed. And if we can make a couple bucks in the process, so be it.
Adina, you had a question. You're still, there you go.
My question is there someone that you're aware of now that uses similar types of rhetoric in terms of expressing their thoughts that we would probably agree with, since everyone's susceptible to that type?
Yeah. So like politically, I think probably Bernie Sanders was the closest.
I was wondering about that. That's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah. I won't go through the whole, you know, presentation again, but he is the most sort of stylistically, rhetorically similar to Donald Trump. Some other people though that like the one that's been really interesting to watch in the last 6-8 weeks is Governor Cuomo of New York. And he is very engaging. He is the antidote to Donald Trump if you're watching his daily things. And yet he's also invested in a very similar sort of authoritarianism. And so if you watch him when he talks, he's the guy in charge. He's the one making all the decisions. He is in many ways demonstrating the sort of same strongman rhetoric, but it's much more palatable to people like me because it aligns with my values, right? It like, let's not kill a bunch of people if we don't have to. He was really slow to act. He totally screwed up New York's response to the thing. He, in many cases, has blown the response in nearly as many ways as Donald Trump, but he's much more interesting and much more comforting to listen to as a speaker because he aligns a lot with my beliefs and my values. And so I would encourage you, if you're watching those daily updates, to sort of watch the ways in which he invests himself with all sorts of power to make decisions that really aren't his decisions to make, but nevertheless, he collects the power to himself and identifies with the people in his audience. It's fascinating.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you, Ryan. Let's give him a big hand.